I was asked to talk about the library as a movement. The idea is pretty simple. It won't take but a minute to explain. It goes like this. Instead of thinking of the library as a place or a collection or even an agency that employs folks, think of it as an umbrella where librarians work with different people across the community to improve the community, help the community make smarter decisions, and ultimately help people find meaning in their lives. It is tied to the mission of a librarian to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in his or her community. So the building is a tool. It's a tool that allows people to come together with other tools in a place. A collection of books and other materials are also tools that librarians steward and community members use. Programs, services, engagement can happen in a building or not, but it is the engagement that makes it a library. So, there you go. Those words, even the outline of the idea is pretty easy, but as with most things, the devil's in the details. It is those details that I want to talk about, and it is the sum of those details that help us understand what happens with libraries in the pandemic and what we need to do now to get out of it and move forward. Let's start with the part of the mission that says our job is to improve society. This one phrase, that we seek to improve society, means we are in the business of change. To improve something means you must both understand where something is and where it needs to go. Librarians, for a couple hundred years, could certainly see that in their work. After all, we help people read, we help people learn, we help people change for the better. For more than a century, that kind of statement was seen as objective and unbiased. After all, who could deny that a more literate community, a more powerful, a more able community was a bad thing? The answer, of course, is a bunch of people. You had to see this coming. And you might think this is when I talk about challenged books, the religious conservatives that want our collections excised of magical wizards and mentions of trans rights. But instead, I want to talk about the backlash to libraries carrying a new type of item in the late 1800s. In 1882, one newspaper ran an editorial against the public library carrying novels. They said those who would read such trash were, quote, school children, factory and shop girls, men who tended bars, drove carriages, and worked on farms and boats, and finally, fallen women, and in general the denizens of the midnight world, night owl prowlers, and those who live upon sin and its wages. Once again, this was talking about literary novels. Today, we see novels and fiction as instrumental in our mission to promote literacy. What changed? The answer is that libraries not only stood their ground, but joined with others in the community to make the case and support a broader sense of education and learning than simply the accumulation of facts. Today, we see literacy and novels as an unbiased provision of access because the general public now holds this belief as well. That does not mean that in the past or the present our actions were or are neutral. Librarians undertook a change process. In the recent past, we've seen the same change process take place with everything from paperback books in the collection to providing access to the internet to makerspaces. Each of these activities were in fact movements seeking to change both how librarians and the community define a library. As a librarian, you are not neutral or passive or waiting for a question. You are a radical, positive change agent within your community. If you allow girls to enter your libraries and read what they choose, you are making an easy choice in Australia, but a life-threatening one in Afghanistan. A drag queen story hour in Sydney might be a fun option, but it got librarians fired in my current home of South Carolina. And here we come back to the idea of a movement. Because while librarians can try and change the world and the minds of their communities on their own, we will never succeed. If we see ourselves as a service for our community, then we have little agency to change things. For the community is a phrase that reduces us too quickly down to a commodity that must make ourselves attractive and lure in those who need us, and to serve those who most need us only to the point that it does not upset a majority. However, if we are a library of the community, not for it, but part of it, then we have not only a voice, but an obligation to push our communities forward. Because now we don't work for the community, we are members of it. We improve the literacy or representation or condition of community members because in doing so, we help ourselves as well. The difference is in pointing out that a taxpayer can't read versus feeling an obligation to a neighbor who can't. The idea that a library is a movement goes one step further. If my neighbor can't read, I can't ensure that he or she will read on my own. I need help. I need to team with schools and town halls and the local restaurant to ensure that all members of my community can read. Several years ago, I was on a community literacy project funded by the Hearst Foundation. We sought to understand what a community literacy initiative looked like and how it would work. We learned the true power and necessity of movement thinking. For example, we teamed with local teachers at a struggling elementary school, together with the librarians of the local library. What we discovered was that while both teacher and librarian used the same terms, they didn't mean the same thing. To the teachers, increased literacy meant the decoding of symbols on a page, connections to phonetics and concepts to increase the capability of students in understanding what was in a text. The youth librarians at the local library, they defined literacy work as connecting a student with books and materials that fostered a love of reading. This led to confused parents and students because they kept hearing the same term being used differently. We also discovered that simply demonstrating the necessity of reading couldn't just happen in literate places like schools and libraries. Students and parents alike needed to see how important reading was to the local pizza maker. They needed to see the importance of literacy at parades and youth sports activities. Local employers had to see not only the importance of reading, but see how important it was to read at a grade level by third grade. When Boeing, a very large aircraft manufacturer, moved their manufacturing operations to South Carolina, they had a hard time hiring workers that could operate their high-tech manufacturing tools. So, they started STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics programs in the local high schools. They found that high school was too late because the kids couldn't read well enough to learn the science. They realized they had to take a very long view and support basic literacy in elementary school. Boeing realized it needed to support a movement of librarians and teachers and politicians and parents in order to effectively work in the community. Reading had to move past the responsibility of a teacher to a joint effort across the county. At one of the program events we did for this project, an education professor was demonstrating to parents how to read to their children. After the session, a mother came up to the professor with a baby in her arms, and the mother asked, "On this page, what did you say?" After the professor repeated her words, the mother would ask about another page, and then another. The professor soon realized the mother couldn't read. But the mother knew it was important for her child, and so she was going to memorize that whole book. That mother needed a literacy movement. teachers to help the children, tutors to help the mother, a library to connect them all to resources and each other. Cazenovia is a small and frankly very wealthy village in central New York. While the village has some strong income base, it is located in actually one of the poorest counties in the entire state. The library director, Betsy Kennedy, realized that a lot of poor families were not coming to the library, but instead were going to the local food pantry. So she set up an early literacy program in the food pantry. At the end of one of these sessions, she was giving out books, new books, to the kids in the program. She handed a book to an 8-year-old girl who then started to cry. When asked why she was crying, the girl said, "This is the first new thing I have ever owned." That book represented so much more than a thing to access or to read. It was a declaration of worthiness. Betsy expanded the program first to churches across the county. And then to the parents, she began bringing in programs for the parents to help them finish their high school degrees. The point is that while Betsy, as a librarian, was instrumental in helping these families, she couldn't have done it on her own. Not only did she need her movement to include people at the food pantry, but educators and tutors, and most importantly, her village community. She needed taxpayers to be okay funding this program. When taxpayer funds were not enough, the community itself gathered and donated money and their time to make the system work. And to be clear, these movements, these proactive efforts of librarians connecting people across a community goes far beyond literacy and reading. On June 17, 2015, a 21-year-old white man walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He sat through a Bible study, and as that Bible study ended, he shot and killed 9 black practitioners in an act of evil racism. What followed was a sort of awakening, an intense discussion of race in the state. It eventually led to the removal of Confederate flag that had, to that point, flown over the state capitol. However, 5 years later, after the murder of George Floyd and during the COVID lockdown, protesters took to the streets of Charleston. Many community leaders recognized that in the intervening 5 years, the conversation on race and racism had not progressed. So they asked the public library to take the lead in rekindling the conversation. Why the library? Well, during the pandemic, the library had proven itself a place not just of refuge, but a place of positive change. It had opened its doors for voting in the 2020 elections. It became a point first for COVID testing and then vaccination. About an hour up the way at the Richland Public Library, they had been hosting a series of events called Let's Talk Race. These didn't start with the Floyd killing, but instead formed years earlier. They had former white supremacists sitting next to black elders in an audience of 50 or more, talking about how the community could overcome racism and come together. And here's the important part. The library didn't just put out a flyer and set out chairs. They sent librarians for facilitation training. Before one flyer was printed, the staff sat together and had the difficult conversation themselves. The librarians then were part of the conversation, not just hosting it. This is what it means to be a movement. The form, the topic, doesn't matter. It might look like a community makerspace. It might look like a community-wide reading club around a single book. It might look like co-working spaces in libraries for entrepreneurs or co-learning spaces for students enrolled in online programs. It might look like bicycle book carts riding through local neighborhoods or pop-up collections on a beach. What the movement does doesn't matter. Where the movement occurs doesn't matter. That people come together and join with librarians and their tools, that's what matters. And now comes the important part. The important part is that our communities desperately need us right now. The COVID pandemic has shown us both what happens when you don't see the library as a movement and what happens when you do. When our libraries closed their physical spaces, none of us were prepared. For many of us, when we shut our doors, all our great talks of community hubs and living rooms and third spaces just stopped. Many of us began our pandemic response by looking to our value in tools. We increased our budgets for ebooks. We pumped up the power on our Wi-Fi and let folks park in the parking lot to get online. But then, incredible things started happening. Librarians began online story hours. Speaker series went online, and instead of 10 or 20 people showing up, hundreds did. We began connecting to experts in the community to create new online programs. I mentioned the Charleston County Public Library before. They began offering online Tai Chi classes. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, here in the States, they let librarians with a hobby or a passion create their own video series. It got to the point that they had to schedule the sessions like a TV station to ensure they didn't overwhelm the community, and so the librarians would also have some time to attend to their other duties. The Toronto Public Library called over 10,000 of their members, particularly seniors, just to check in, provide some human contact. These efforts demonstrated in the most beautiful way that the true collection of a library is not the books or the shelved items, but the community itself. These librarians showed the power not of collection development, but of connection development. As vaccines rolled out in the spring, libraries began opening up for more services and more people. However, as has become clear with the resurgent Delta variant, the future remains uncertain. However, libraries in the U.S. have been taking stock of the past year and thinking about what lies ahead. The days when online and in-person were seen as disconnected are over. Many librarians report quickly advancing services that had been long discussed, such as suddenly we were able to do online library card registration. We were able to provide unrestricted virtual meeting spaces and advanced on loaning out hotspots and items and materials. Libraries have seen their spaces as more useful for non-collection activities. Librarians are using their buildings to create safe spaces for testing, vaccination, voting, food distribution, and co-locating social services with information services. In many ways, COVID has accelerated putting the community needs, regardless of the relationship to the collection, at the center of what they do. COVID has also begun a serious soul searching about librarians as a workforce. In the height of the pandemic, many frontline librarians rejected virtue calls to be first responders or to serve their communities without regard to their own safety. Librarians, as workers, used the pandemic to demonstrate the divide between administration and the front line, and for administration to place the safety of employees at the top of the decision list. The idea of librarians being first responders has now morphed into the idea of first restorers, that our librarians in public, academic, school, and special libraries had to be ready to stitch together communities after the trauma of a pandemic and other disasters. We could more clearly see that the librarians and staff of a library are a community in and of themselves and also need to be cared for. Many libraries are implementing hybrid and flexible work schedules. Many libraries are implementing wellness services for staff and the public alike. Now, I could end here. Happy librarian land, where once again we are the heroes of our story. But that would not only be dishonest, but miss the most important work we have before us today. You see, the corollary of being of the community is that you represent that community, the good and the bad. In Australia, as in the United States, our libraries are built on indigenous lands. Our institutions still carry vestiges of systemic racism. We don't get to ignore those or think somehow we can out-virtue our past. Being of the community means we have an obligation to recognize where our work creates inequities. Being of the community means we have to use our voice to indeed work towards a better society. We also have before us today a desperate need to use our power and tools and partners to move us out of the pandemic. We must team with medical community to increase access to vaccines and, more importantly, to confront misinformation and conspiracy theories. We must recognize that this pandemic has been made worse by growing international xenophobia and nationalism that has turned science into a divisive politics and undermined rationalism for dogma. We must recognize that as national narratives have fractured, we must be part of building up local narratives that are inclusive and celebrate diversity. We must demonstrate, starting with our own field, that to love something is not to be uncritical, but to find our faults and work to be better. We must be a global movement, across borders, that builds a better society, one local relationship at a time. Thank you.